They said her face carried a curse that could strike a man blind, a grotesque reminder of the devil's work. But when a hardened mountain man finally cut away her dark, heavy veil in the dead of winter, he didn't run. Instead, he fell straight to his trembling knees. The year was 1886, and the bitter wind howling through the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho Territory carried the undeniable promise of a brutal winter. Down in the valley, the mining town of Highgrove was a festering wound of mud, timber, and desperate men. It was not a place built for the faint of heart, nor was it a place that welcomed outsiders with warm embraces. It was a place of survival. Caleb Dawson only descended into Highgrove twice a year. Standing at 6'3", broad-shouldered and wrapped in thick grizzly fur and weathered buckskin, Caleb was a man the town respected but fundamentally feared. His face, weathered by brutal winters and relentless sun, bore the deep, stoic lines of a man who had seen too much and chosen the company of towering pines over people. 8 years ago, Caleb had been a different man. He had been a hopeful pioneer, crossing the treacherous Snake River with his young bride, Clara. But the river had surged, the wagon had shattered, and Caleb had found only Clara's torn blue shawl snagged on a willow branch, and later, a body battered beyond recognition downstream. He had buried his heart in that unmarked grave, retreating to the highest timber lines to live as a phantom. On this frigid Tuesday in late November, Caleb was loading sacks of flour, salt, and coffee onto his pack mule outside Hiram Cobb's general store. The town was unusually loud. A commotion had gathered near the mud-churned center of the main thoroughfare. Caleb secured a knot and turned, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing. A crowd had formed, jeering and stepping back in a synchronized rhythm of morbid curiosity and disgust. In the center of the ring stood Bartholomew Shaw, a notoriously ruthless drifter known for peddling snake oil and stolen livestock. But Shaw wasn't selling tonics today. He held a thick hemp rope, the other end of which was tied tightly around the waist of a trembling woman. She was a small, fragile silhouette, swallowed by an oversized, filthy wool coat. But what drew the horrified gasps of the townsfolk was her head. It was completely encased in a thick, suffocating black mourning veil. The fabric was dense, tied securely around her neck so that not a single inch of skin or hair could be seen. "Hide her face!" shrieked Agatha Higgins, the owner of the local boarding house, pressing a handkerchief to her nose. "Keep that wretched thing covered, Shaw. The Lord punishes those who look upon the marked." "Step back, folks, lest the affliction leap onto your own flesh," Shaw bellowed, his voice slick with theatrical malice. He gave the rope a vicious yank. The woman stumbled, falling to her knees in the freezing, ankle-deep mud. She made no sound, no cry of pain, no plea for mercy. She survived a blazing inferno in a Kansas madhouse. The fire melted her flesh to the bone, left her a deformed beast, a monster cursed by the Almighty himself. Toss a coin for her upkeep, or I'll lift this veil and let her curse fall upon your children. A few terrified miners threw silver coins into the mud, desperate to appease Shaw. He laughed, kicking the woman in the ribs to force her back to her feet. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had seen the brutality of nature, the swift, indifferent violence of a wolf pack taking down an elk. But the cruelty of men was something he could never stomach. The absolute submission of the veiled woman, the way she curled inward to protect herself from the blows, struck a deeply buried chord in his chest. When Shaw raised a heavy leather riding crop to strike her again, Caleb moved. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He simply strode through the crowd, parting the burly miners like dry grass. Just as the riding crop descended, Caleb's massive, calloused hand shot out, catching Shaw's wrist mid-air. The impact sounded like a cracking branch. "That's enough." Caleb's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the wind, yet the entire street fell dead silent. Shaw wrenched his arm back, his eyes flashing with sudden fear before he puffed out his chest. "Mind your business, mountain man. This creature is my property. I hold the papers of guardianship. She ain't fit for decent society." "No human being is a sideshow, Shaw," Caleb said, his gaze as cold as the ice forming on the town's water troughs. He reached into his heavy leather satchel and pulled out 3 prime, thick beaver pelts, the absolute best of his season's trapping. In 1886, they were worth their weight in gold, easily enough to buy a small homestead. He threw them at Shaw's boots. "The contract," Caleb demanded, his hand resting casually but purposefully on the heavy handle of the Colt revolver at his hip. "Give it to me." Shaw looked at the pelts, greed instantly overpowering his pride. He scrambled to snatch them up, shaking the freezing mud from the luxurious fur. He reached into his coat and produced a crumpled, heavily stamped legal document, practically shoving it into Caleb's chest. "Take the beast," Shaw spat, backing away, a nasty sneer curling his lip. "But don't come crying to the law when you pull back that curtain and see the devil looking back at you. She don't speak. She don't show her face. You'll wake up with a demon at your throat." Caleb ignored him. He stepped toward the woman. She flinched violently, shrinking away from him, her hands coming up to clutch the bottom edge of the black veil, terrified he was about to tear it away. "I'm not going to touch your veil," Caleb said softly, ensuring only she could hear him. He pulled a sharp hunting knife from his belt. The woman trembled uncontrollably. With a swift, precise motion, Caleb sliced through the thick hemp rope binding her waist. He holstered his knife and took a step back, giving her space. "My name is Caleb Dawson. You are not a prisoner anymore. If you want to stay in High Grove, you are free to do so. If you have nowhere else to go, my cabin is a day's ride up the mountain. It's warm, and you will be safe." The townspeople watched in stunned silence. The veiled woman slowly turned her head toward the imposing mountains looming in the distance, then back to the towering man before her. Slowly, agonizingly, she reached out a gloved, trembling hand and gripped the thick leather sleeve of Caleb's coat. She was choosing the mountain. The ascent into the bitter roots was grueling. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and by mid-afternoon heavy, wet flakes of snow began to fall, rapidly burying the rocky trail. Caleb rode his mare, leading the pack mule upon which the veiled woman sat perched among the flour sacks. She had not spoken a single word. She had not adjusted her veil. When the wind howled and drove the bitter cold deep into their bones, Caleb stopped, took off his massive fleece-lined buffalo coat, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She froze at his proximity, her breathing ragged and shallow beneath the black fabric. But as the heavy warmth of the coat enveloped her, she subtly leaned into it. It was long past dark when they finally broke through the timberline and arrived at Caleb's cabin. Built of massive hand-hewn cedar logs and chinked with mountain clay, it was a fortress against the brutal elements. Caleb helped her down from the mule, his hands gripping her waist just long enough to set her on the snow-covered porch before he pulled away. Inside, he struck a match, and soon the stone hearth was roaring with a fire that bathed the room in a warm, golden glow. The cabin was immaculately clean, though entirely lacking a woman's touch. Rifles hung on the walls alongside dried herbs, traps, and snowshoes. Caleb pulled a heavy wooden chair to the fire. "Sit," he offered gently. "Get warm." She obeyed silently, sinking into the chair. "I'll make us some stew," Caleb said, moving to the cast-iron stove. As he worked, chopping dried venison and root vegetables, he watched her out of the corner of his eye. The town's rumors echoed in his mind. Melted flesh. A demon. A curse. Caleb didn't believe in curses, but he knew the profound trauma that physical disfigurement could cause in a society that valued only perfection. When the stew was ready, he placed a steaming wooden bowl on a small table beside her, along with a spoon and a cup of hot, sweet coffee. He then took his own bowl and sat on the opposite side of the room, keeping his back turned slightly to give her privacy. He listened as she carefully lifted the very bottom edge of the heavy black fabric, just enough to slip the spoon underneath. She ate ravenously, though with desperate caution, terrified of exposing even an inch of her chin. 3 days passed. A fierce, relentless blizzard locked them inside the cabin, burying the windows in snow. In the enforced intimacy of the small space, a quiet routine developed. Caleb chopped wood, mended his gear, and cooked. The veiled woman, whom Caleb had simply begun calling Miss, started helping. She would sweep the floor, wash the tin plates, and fold the blankets. But the tension was a living, breathing thing in the room. She slept in the only bed, fully clothed, the veil still pinned tightly around her head, while Caleb slept on a bedroll near the hearth. It was on the fourth evening that things began to change. Caleb was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of soft pine, when he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. The woman was sitting by the window, mending a tear in one of his flannel shirts. Thinking Caleb was asleep, she was humming. It was a faint, breathy melody, an old Appalachian lullaby about a mockingbird and a diamond ring. But it wasn't the song itself that shocked Caleb, it was the cadence. The specific, slightly syncopated rhythm, skipping the exact same half note that his late wife, Clara, used to skip because she always forgot the breath on the third measure. Caleb's knife slipped, slicing a deep gash into his thumb. He hissed in pain, dropping the wood. The humming stopped instantly. The woman scrambled to her feet, dropping the shirt, her body rigid with terror. "I'm sorry," Caleb said quickly, wrapping a rag around his bleeding thumb. "Just clumsy. Didn't mean to frighten you." She stood there, her head tilted toward him. Slowly, she stepped forward. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a clean strip of white cotton, and knelt beside his chair. Without a word, she gently took his massive hand in her small, delicate ones. Her touch was surprisingly soft, her fingers deft as she wrapped the wound and tied a perfect, secure knot. Caleb looked down at her hands. They were pale, unscarred, and beautiful. "You don't have to hide from me," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't felt in nearly a decade. "Shaw is dead to you. High Grove is miles below us. Whatever happened in your past, whatever fire, whatever scars you carry, I swear on my life, you will find no judgment here, only safety." The woman froze. Her hands lingered on his. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the pine logs in the hearth and the howling wind beating against the reinforced door. Then she slowly reached up. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely grasp the thick iron pin holding the veil at the back of her neck. Caleb didn't move. He barely breathed. With a soft metallic click, the pin gave way. The woman closed her eyes beneath the fabric, bracing herself for the horror, the disgust, the pity she had been told for years she would receive. She grasped the heavy black wool and pulled it up and over her head, letting it fall to the wooden floorboards with a soft thud. Caleb Dawson braced himself. He expected melted skin. He expected the tragic ravages of a merciless fire. Instead, the firelight danced across a face that was completely, breathtakingly flawless. Pale porcelain skin, a delicate, straight nose, and a cascade of long, raven-black hair that tumbled wildly over her shoulders. But it was not her profound, untouched beauty that drained the blood from Caleb's face. It was the small, distinct, crescent-shaped birthmark resting just below her left cheekbone. It was the exact, perfect curve of her lips. And as she finally dared to open her eyes, terrified of what she would see in his face, Caleb was met with a gaze of vivid, haunting, unparalleled emerald green. The air was sucked from Caleb's lungs. His heart seized violently against his ribs. He knew those eyes. He had dreamed of them every night for 8 years. He had wept for them until he had no tears left to shed. He had buried an empty, unrecognizable shell of a woman, believing those green eyes were closed forever. "Clara?" Caleb choked out, the name tearing from his throat like a physical wound. The woman gasped, stepping back, her green eyes wide with an explosive mixture of shock and terror. How do you know my name?" Shaw told me. "He told me I had no one. He told me my mind was broken." Caleb's massive frame shuddered. The strength that had conquered mountains, fought off wolves, and carried him through a decade of solitary torment vanished in a single heartbeat. His legs gave out completely. The hardened mountain man collapsed, falling straight to his knees on the rough-hewn floorboards. He reached out, his trembling, calloused hands gently, reverently framing her face, terrified that if he touched her too hard, she would evaporate into the mountain mist. "Clara," he sobbed, the sound an agonizing release of 8 years of suffocating grief. He buried his face in her waist, weeping with the raw, shattered abandon of a man who had just been handed back his soul. "My God, Clara, it's me. It's Caleb." Clara stood frozen, her breath hitching in her chest as the giant of a man wept into the coarse fabric of her dress. The name he had spoken, Caleb, echoed in her mind, not as a sound, but as a violent tremor, shaking the very foundations of her shattered memory. Caleb, she whispered, the word tasting of dust and long-forgotten sunshine. She lowered her hands, her trembling fingers tentatively brushing against the thick, coarse hair at the nape of his neck. As her thumb traced the line of his jaw, she felt it a jagged, raised crescent scar just beneath his right ear. A flash of lightning struck behind her eyes, a rusted plowshare, a sunny afternoon in Independence, Missouri. A younger Caleb laughing, bleeding, while she pressed a white petticoat to his neck. "You tore your good shirt," she murmured, the words spilling from her lips before she even understood what they meant. Caleb's head snapped up, his dark eyes, swimming in tears, locked onto hers. He reached up, grasping her wrists with a desperation that bordered on madness. "Yes, yes, Clara. We were plowing the south field before we left for the Oregon Trail. You scolded me for ruining the linen. Oh, dear God, you remember." Clara stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of the wooden chair. She collapsed into it, her hands flying to her temples as 8 years of carefully constructed lies began to violently crumble. Bartholomew Shaw had told her she was an orphan named Mary. He had told her she had been caught in a horrific asylum fire in Kansas, that her mind was as mutilated as her face. He had kept her drugged on laudanum and fear, dragging her from town to town, beating her into silent submission. "The river," Clara gasped, her chest heaving as the dam in her mind broke. "We were crossing the Snake River, the ferry ropes." "They didn't just snap, Caleb. Someone cut them." Caleb's blood ran cold. The grief that had hollowed him out for a decade suddenly morphed into a blinding, white-hot fury. "What are you saying?" "I remember the cold water," Clara choked out, tears finally spilling over her dark lashes, cutting tracks through the dust on her porcelain cheeks. "I was pulled under. When I woke up, I was on the muddy banks miles downstream. There were men, drifters. They had a camp. One of them was Shaw." Caleb stood slowly, his massive frame casting a terrifying shadow across the firelit cabin. The unrecognizable battered body he had buried by the river, a woman found 3 days later in the swollen rapids, had not been his wife. It had been some other poor soul, swept away by the treacherous current. "Shaw took you," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a deadly, gravelly whisper. "I had struck my head on the river rocks," Clara cried, pressing her hands to the back of her skull. "I didn't know who I was. I couldn't speak for months. Shaw dragged me to the Idaho Territorial Asylum down in Blackfoot. He worked there as a ward master. When the territorial funding dried up, he realized he could make a living off the patients. He took me. He convinced me I was a grotesque monster, that if anyone saw my face, they would kill me. The veil. He said the veil was the only thing keeping me alive." Caleb looked at his wife, the woman he had mourned with every breath he took. She had been subjected to a living hell, paraded as a sideshow freak by the very man who had likely cut the ferry ropes to loot the wrecked pioneer wagons. Shaw hadn't just stolen Caleb's pelts today in Highgrove. He had stolen 8 years of their lives. Caleb walked to the wall and pulled down his heavy Winchester repeating rifle. He racked the lever, the metallic clack-clack ringing out with lethal finality. "I paid him for your life," Caleb said, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "But he still owes me for the 8 years he stole. You stay here, Clara. Lock the heavy iron bolt." Clara leaped up, grabbing the barrel of the rifle before he could turn toward the door. "No, Caleb. The blizzard is too fierce. You'll freeze to death before you ever reach the valley. He isn't worth your life. You're here. I'm here. Don't let him take you from me again." Caleb looked down at her hands, gripping the steel barrel, then up into those emerald eyes. The raw desperation in her face broke through his rage. He slowly lowered the weapon, pulling her into his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of her, finally allowing himself to believe she was real. "I won't leave you," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "Never again." But the mountains, much like men, are unpredictable and cruel. They would not have to go down to Highgrove to find Bartholomew Shaw, because Shaw was already coming for them. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, isolating the cabin in a fortress of impenetrable white. For Caleb and Clara, it was a sacred resurrection. They spent the hours untangling the lost years. Clara's memory returned in fragmented bursts, the agonizing confusion of the asylum, the cruelty of Shaw's heavy hand, the suffocating darkness of the veil. Caleb held her through the night terrors, his presence an immovable mountain shielding her from the ghosts of her past. By the morning of the third day, the wind finally died, leaving behind a heavy, deafening silence. The sky cracked open, revealing a piercing, crystalline blue. Caleb stepped onto the porch to clear the snow, the bitter morning air burning his lungs. He was halfway through chopping a fresh cord of cedar when his instincts, honed by years of surviving the wild, flared. A flock of ravens suddenly took flight from the pines a quarter-mile down the ridge, their harsh cries shattering the stillness. Caleb dropped the axe. He didn't run, but his long strides ate up the distance to the cabin in seconds. He threw open the door. "Clara, get away from the windows." She didn't ask questions. The pioneer woman who had braved the Oregon Trail was fully awake now. She grabbed his heavy Colt revolver from the table and moved to the back corner of the room, behind the stone hearth. Caleb snatched his Winchester from the wall and cracked the heavy wooden window shutter just enough to peer down the snow-covered trail. 3 figures were trudging up the mountain, waist-deep in the powder. Bartholomew Shaw was in the lead, flanked by 2 notorious High Grove enforcers, Jebediah Boone and a scarred drifter named Wyatt. Shaw hadn't come for revenge over a bruised ego. He had come because his greed was insatiable. He had recognized the unique territorial stamp on Caleb's beaver pelts. He knew Caleb Dawson was a legendary trapper, and Shaw believed there was a fortune in gold and furs hidden in this cabin. Furthermore, Shaw couldn't risk the mountain man bringing the freak back to civilization and exposing his fraudulent cruelty to the territorial marshals. "Dawson!" Shaw's voice echoed off the icy timber, sharp and breathless from the climb. He stopped 50 yards from the cabin, raising a scoped Sharps buffalo rifle. "I know you're in there. Toss out your furs, your lockbox, and send the freak out to me. Do that, and my boys here might let you live." Caleb pushed the barrel of his Winchester through the narrow gap in the shutter. "You're trespassing, Shaw. Turn back, or the mountain claims you today." Shaw laughed, a sickening, arrogant sound. "You're outnumbered, mountain man. Jebediah, put a hole in that door." A thunderous crack ripped through the valley. Wood splintered above Caleb's head as a heavy lead ball tore through the doorframe. Caleb didn't hesitate. He sighted Wyatt the man, raising a repeater on the left, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked, and Wyatt folded into the snow instantly, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky. "Take cover!" Shaw screamed, diving behind a massive, snow-laden boulder. Jebediah scrambled behind a fallen pine log, laying down a suppressing fire that chewed up the front of the cabin. Splinters of cedar rained down inside the room. Caleb pumped the lever, firing twice more, but the angles were bad. "Clara, stay down!" he roared over the deafening gunfire. But Clara was not the terrified, veiled woman from the mud of Highgrove. She crawled along the floorboards, her hands gripping the heavy Colt. She reached the side window, the one flanking the woodpile. She carefully pushed the latch up and eased the shutter open an inch. Jebediah was creeping around the side, hoping to flank Caleb's position. He was completely focused on the front door, oblivious to the side window. Clara cocked the hammer. Her hands were perfectly steady. She remembered how Caleb had taught her to shoot on the plains of Nebraska. She took a breath, held it, and pulled the trigger. The heavy Colt roared. Jebediah shouted, his leg buckling as the bullet shattered his kneecap. He collapsed into the snowdrift, dropping his weapon and screaming in agony. "Jebediah!" Shaw panicked, suddenly realizing he was entirely alone and outgunned. The cowardice that defined his soul took over. He dropped his heavy buffalo rifle and turned to run, desperately trying to plunge back down the snowy trail. Caleb kicked the shattered front door open. He stepped onto the porch, raising the Winchester to his shoulder. "Shaw!" Caleb's voice was the wrath of the wilderness itself. Shaw stumbled, turning back, his face pale with terror. He reached inside his coat, pulling a small Derringer pistol. Caleb fired. The bullet struck Shaw squarely in the chest. The impact threw the corrupt grifter backward into the deep snow. He lay there, staring up at the blinding blue sky, the silence of the mountain rushing in to claim him, as his blood stained the pristine white snow crimson. Caleb stood on the porch, his chest heaving, the smoke trailing from the barrel of his rifle. Slowly, he lowered the weapon. He felt a soft, warm hand slide around his waist. Clara stepped out onto the porch beside him, the cold wind whipping her dark hair around her flawless face. She didn't look at the bodies. She looked at her husband. "It's over," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion, turning to wrap his massive arms around her. "No," Clara smiled, her emerald eyes shining with unshed tears as she buried her face in the warm fleece of his coat. "It's just beginning." The townsfolk of Highgrove would eventually hear the rumors of what happened on the mountain, but Caleb and Clara Dawson never returned to the muddy, miserable settlement. They remained in the high timber, a king and queen of the Bitterroots, their love a fiery beacon that had survived the darkest of nights, proving that no veil, no lie, and no cruel twist of fate could ever blind a man to the true face of his soulmate. What a breathtaking journey of betrayal, survival, and a love that refused to be buried by time or tragedy. Caleb and Clara's story proves that the truth will always shine through the darkest veils of deception. Did this intense Wild West romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If Caleb and Clara's fierce loyalty moved your heart, please smash that like button, share this incredible tale with your friends, and subscribe for more epic historical dramas. See you next time.